Welcome to Could Be Pretty Cool News, the podcast where we dive into the exciting world of creative entrepreneurship. I'm your host, Casey, and together we'll embark on a journey to explore this dynamic ecosystem from multiple angles, including academia, research and data, community building, and compelling personal narratives from creative entrepreneurs themselves. Get ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered as we uncover the stories and strategies behind building successful creative ventures. It's time to discover why the world of creative entrepreneurship could be pretty cool. Data has traditionally been seen as the opposite of creativity. Cold, analytical, removed from the human experience. But as you know here on Could Be Pretty Cool News, we love exploring how data and creativity work well together to tell deeper stories about our communities and culture. Today, we're continuing that conversation with two guests who are proving that numbers and narratives are both compatible and complementary. First up, we'll hear from Professor Ness Sándoval, a demography expert from St. Louis University who's working to make data more accessible to community organizations and helping quantify the impact of creative communities. His approach to demography for democracy shows how data can be a powerful tool for advocacy when it's freely available to the people who need it most. So, we are joined by another amazing guest. If I could have you introduce yourself and tell the listeners what it is that you do.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. My name is Ness Sándoval. I am a professor of demography and sociology at St. Louis University. And half my job is teaching, and the other half is doing research. But that research is applied research. I'm interested in trying to understand what's really happening in society and how do we imagine or reimagine what the future may look like if we understand what society looks like today.
So, for the folks listening, can you explain a little bit more about the key concepts of demography and why understanding population dynamics is actually important?
Yeah, so demography focuses on three demographic transitions. We are all born, so it focuses on births. We will all die, so we focus on mortality. And many of us become migrants. We are movers. And so the definition of a mover is if you move from one county to another county. And so we have domestic movers and then we have international migrants. But in many cases, most of us have moved according to the US Census definition. There's a handful of Americans that were born and still live in the county that they were born in and have not moved. But that's very difficult today. Most people have at least moved once in their life.
So that's really interesting. I now live in Atlanta, but was not born and raised in Atlanta. And I can say without a doubt, being here in this city definitely impacted my career and my creative career specifically, just due to the nature of the city and the resources that the city provides for creators and entrepreneurs. And so I'm curious, how can demographic data be used to better identify the specific needs of creators, artists, independent artists, creative entrepreneurs in different communities?
Sure. So we actually work with quite a few organizations that are interested in understanding the movement of artists, understanding the demographic profile of different types of artists. So it's quite amazing what has happened over the past 20 years with the advent of with technology and making data more available to researchers. We do collect quite a bit of data on different demographic groups in the US. And I just had a meeting in December to try to get a sense of the artistic community in St. Louis. What do we know about them? The age, how many are into music versus arts, and so forth. And so these are questions I think decade ago, many people said, we don't really can't answer this. But we look at this today and say, we have pretty good data today. And so what this data allows us to do is to identify cities that are attracting young artists. And so Atlanta's one, Nashville's another one that is a very great scene for artists. And so we're able to see why young people are moving to different communities and trying to understand what their occupations are. And in fact, what we understand is like many artists, they have a primary occupation, the artist, the music, whatever it is, their secondary. There's a few that being an artist is their primary, but oftentimes it's a very diverse group of experiences that people bring to their artistic expression.
A question that has either organically come up or in some way has come up in almost everyone that we've interviewed this season has been about the role of AI in work and in your work in particular. So you study data, I'm sure from various sources. Have you used AI in this work yet? And do you have any thoughts about what the role of AI is going to be in demography studies?
Yes, this is a great question. And so let me explain it through a story. So when the 2000 census came out, I employed about 5 students to help me work with the data to build databases and to analyze it. Five to 7 students actually. When the 2010 census came out, I had 2 students. When the 2020 census came out, I didn't have any students. And so what happened over that 20-year period is that we were able to develop a series of codes which reduced my reliance on students. I still work with students and I still employ students, but they're doing different types of work now compared to what my students were doing in 2020. And so I tell people this because they can't believe it, but like when the census is dropped, within 60 seconds, I have my charts. Within 60 seconds, we are analyzing and producing and sharing on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter and so forth, the data within 60 seconds. Back in 2000, it took us months, right? And so you can see what's happening. AI for our field still has problems with applied demography. It's still theoretical demography, no problem when you answer a set of questions that are static. But what it cannot do, at least today, it cannot be creative and it doesn't understand the lived experience because it doesn't have a consciousness. And so when we in our demographic research, we're always able to do something creative and new. AI cannot do that. AI can simply say, we can reproduce this, we can be very efficient, but it doesn't know how to think about something new for applied demography. And so I've actually been quite disappointed because I've tested it in my class to make sure that it was cheat proof. And I'm like, yeah, it cannot answer any of the questions. It does a very good job at writing it up, but it fundamentally still struggles with basic applied math and complicated math where you have to make human decisions about assumptions, about missing data, about substitutions and things like that. I'm not that worried about it today. There's some new machines coming online this year. But what I hear from people is like it still struggles with applied math and complicated math problems.
Interesting. So, another issue that is probably top of mind for a lot of people at this current juncture in our socio political climate is the role of demographics, in particular when it comes to advocacy efforts and policy decisions. And so, what do you think about like what demographic data should be considered to ensure that efforts, in particular for advocating for creative communities, independent artists and cities, are inclusive and equitable as possible?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So I have a project that's called Demography for Democracy. And in this project, our goal is to give data out for free. We and I've always said this to people. This came about 2016, 2015, where people were asking for data, but they didn't have money. And money should never be a barrier to understanding and advocating for justice, or advocating for equity, or advocating for improving the human condition. There should not be a condition that you have the money to do it. And so what I decided to do is we would no longer allow economics to be a barrier to information that we're able to provide. And so I gave a TED talk about this because this was really was important, is that people would come into the community. And I tell people this, it's probably more than 50% of what I'm doing is coming from the community asking me questions. And so most of what I'm doing, I owe to the community and saying, Ness, or what do you know about this topic? I'm seeing this in my neighborhood. Can you see if there's any data there? And I start to explore and I think, well, there really is something here. Let's explore this, let's talk about it. So it comes from people's lived experiences. They just want data to say that they are in fact experiencing what they're telling me they're experiencing. They just want some validation with some data. And so I think that's part of it, is that people are very smart. People are curious and they just need data to quantify it and validate that what they're living is actually in the data that's being collected by different entities. I will say this though, is that what I've seen over the past decade, so there's been tremendous transparency, the tremendous data that's available, but we do see institutions holding on to data and denying data to its residents. And unfortunately, St. Louis is one of these areas where it's difficult to get that. It's not about a political leader. I've been here since 2008, and it doesn't really matter who's in charge. It's the institution itself protects data that actually belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to elected residents. It belongs to the people. But I've seen it over and over again where they deny the requests to get this data for everyday citizens. And even I've seen it in my experience in St. Louis where elected officials were denied requests to get this data. So we have to get to the point where when you're an elected official, you have to believe in transparency and understand that this data belongs to people. And you may not know what they want. It doesn't fit my story. It's going to hurt my reelection. It doesn't matter. It belongs to the people. And so I think this is why I've been very successful over the past 2 years, is that many people see that I'm agnostic when it comes to politics. I don't really care about politics. What I care about is people having good data so they can engage in discussions and they can hold their elected officials responsible for lack of effort in investing in their neighborhoods. Empowering people can be a very good thing if elected officials understand it.
And so that actually leads me to my final question. So many of the stories within indie artist communities and creator communities are anecdotal largely. There isn't, here's the database of what this neighborhood's indie artists are going through. And so, for folks who do want to either impact policy or be able to sit down and have a conversation with elected officials and say, here are the things that are going on, we want you to see this and hear this, who may not have access to academic institutions or even just the time to go through data. Do you have any advice for any aspiring or amateur demographers who want to do better, in particular for their artistic?
I think this is a good question. I think so. There is a barrier to entry, to accessing them the status. So that's what the goal of demography for democracy is, to try to remove that barrier to entry and get the data out. But there is a level of experience that one needs to know to go in and start tapping these databases. And so that's the challenge, is that the data is there, but you have to have a certain level of knowledge to access it and then extract it out. So I think what I would say is that just working here in St. Louis with the artist community, I think anecdotes and stories are forms of information. Right? I don't want to say that this is not important. That's how we started doing this research when I gave this talk at the History Museum about artists. And so the panel was like three people were telling their stories, and I came and told it with quantitative data. Like, do you know how many artists there are in the region? And so I was actually able to put a number to the stories that were being told. I would say that I think in different cities there are different efforts to try to quantify this expression of artists, whether it's music or art, whatever it is that you want to tell about. Because there is this element with grants and justifying what the impact is. I know in St. Louis we're trying to do this and saying this is how many artists we're reaching and touching, and this is the impact on the community. I think going back to the AI, there is some pretty interesting work around AI. But again, there's a barrier to entry in learning how to build a crawler. A crawler is something that goes on the internet and starts to scrape information out. And so if you wanted to see how many poets there were in a region that's publicly making sharing the poetry, you can go and try to capture this and start to quantify it. And so there's some work that can happen in that way, but there's still an entry to barrier that some people still need to learn how to create these AI type tools.
Fantastic. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you're like, oh, I really need to make this
No,
point?
I do. I would just say these are important discussions, and when people says we probably don't have the data, I probably think we probably do have the data. We just need to know and go where to look for it.
Professor Sandoval's work reminds us that data isn't just numbers, it's evidence that validates people's lived experiences. And speaking of lived experiences, our next guest knows firsthand how to bridge the gap between data and storytelling. Zakiya Whatley is a scientist turned digital media entrepreneur who's taking her experience running genetics labs and teaching complex concepts and transformed it into a thriving creative business. She shows us that sometimes the best stories come from unexpected combinations of skills.
Hi, I'm Zakiya Whatley. I'm a scientist, educator, and digital media entrepreneur. So, when I think about how over the years I've blended science and education, which for a long time felt like the only path for me, with digital media entrepreneurship, I think all of this really comes out of running a lab. So, my background is in genetics and genomics. I have a PhD in that, and I did a postdoc, and then I went on to be a biology professor. And when I was running a lab, I was like, hey, I am the CEO of this group of wild undergraduate students who happen to care about how DNA replication works and how biofilms, little tiny bacteria, talk to each other or communicate with each other and build little communities. And so I was like, okay, I basically have a company. How do I talk about the work that we do at this company? How do I make sure that people understand it? And how do I make sure that agencies and organizations fund the work that I'm doing? How do I make it appealing to other students to come into my lab? All of that what meant that I was sometimes giving presentations to parents. Sometimes I was writing grants for NSF. Sometimes I am making PowerPoints for cranky undergraduates at 8 a.m. And sometimes I'm doing videos online for asynchronous learning. So I realized that I was doing all of these things. And then I also found myself using my iPad to create diagrams so they could understand how molecules were working and communicating with each other inside the cell. And it took a little while to really step back and see, hey, you're doing a lot of things that one would consider creative, that are not just picking up a pipette to move tiny volumes of chemicals from one tube to the other. You're doing a lot of creative work. And I really found myself really enjoying that and leaning into it. And so that work, being a scientist and being a college professor, a lot of what I was doing was teaching and engaging students. And being in the lab just felt like teaching and engaging at the highest level, because now there's some skin in it. We hope these experiments work. But I wanted to take that somewhere broader. And I created a podcast called Dope Labs Podcast with one of my really good friends from grad school, TT Shodia. And Dope Labs was built on our friendship and my approach to teaching in the classroom and her approach as well. And so a lot of what people get with Dope Labs is my science and teaching, but combined with the skill it takes to create a successful podcast and to connect with people in the audio format. And so that was maybe the first very clear outward blend of science and education for me in like digital media. It can be really hard to step outside of yourself and see what you're doing, what may be interesting about what you're doing, and how other people might see you. I think so much of my training, I had spent so many years preparing to be a scientist. And I enjoy teaching, I enjoy learning all the things about science, not just biology. I enjoy all the science. If you listen to Dope Labs, you'll hear that. But I think I was transitioning away from, I was in a tenure track position and I was leaving that position. And that was a really hard decision, but it was one that was really good for me. That was not going to be my forever home. And I knew that. And sometimes I didn't want to be a victim of the sunken cost fallacy where we say, oh, I put all this time in here, so I got to keep putting time in here. I think if you're putting a lot of time in something and the boat is sinking, the boat's going to keep sinking even if you keep putting time in it. Okay. So you might as well hop off to the next thing. So I had made this first transition from being a cell biology professor and having a microbiology lab, and then moving to running a PhD program at the University of Maryland. So I was running their PhD program they had an umbrella program that included a lot of biological sciences. I'm doing Dope Labs at the time, but also what I'm doing for this program is teaching students how to teach. Okay, I'm teaching students how to teach. I'm teaching them how to engage. And I'm like, this is marketing with a slant, right? At the same time, I'm also recruiting students to these programs. And so I'm building many websites and I'm throwing events and I'm doing all kinds of things. And that hadn't really been done for the program before. I'm collecting data. I'm analyzing that data about who's interested in our program, who are we reaching, who are we missing, what fields are represented, where do we have funding, what can I project is going to be an issue down the road, how can I start addressing these things. I'm working with people across different institutions, so not just at the University of Maryland, but at NIH and at the Smithsonian, like and I'm coordinating all of these things. I was like, I'm an event planner, I'm a marketer, I am our communications team because I am drafting all the communications for our director. I am doing all of these things. And I had some friends coming to me and saying, hey, I am a consultant. I'm on this project. We need somebody that can do XYZ really quickly. Can you do this? I'm like, no problem. Hey, I'm starting this company. I need somebody to write a business plan. I need somebody to do finances for this stuff. Can you do that? Yep, because I'm managing $500,000 here in this program. Of course, I can do that. So I just found that I was doing these things for other people. They were really pleased with it and saying, you did this better than this other company that we typically use. And I was like, hey, I am a company. And so just for the process of getting paid, I started a company. I just went through the paperwork. And then I realized people were asking me to do more and more things. I started working with an organization that was they were trying to get a little science in the community. They were doing tree plantings, but they wanted people in different neighborhoods to understand the value of having these trees and what kind of care they needed to do. They wanted to figure out, how can we reach out to this community and engage them? And we want to move beyond a book club. We want to have action. How do we do these things? We have some funding. We don't have anybody that can explain the science in a way that's engaging and is not talking down to our audience and all of this stuff. And I was like, oh, I can help you with that because that's what I'm doing with Dope Labs. And so I began to do work for other people, and other people just started asking me to do all kinds of other things. And that's really how I said, all right, I'm building Upstream Solutions for real. And Upstream Solutions will continue to do communications, digital media. Sometimes that means training other people on how to have workshops and do these kind of things. Sometimes it means that I'm facilitating those workshops for folks. And I've gone from making graphics in Canva to I've done work that looked like creating graphics in Canva to creating podcasts for AAAS's Science Magazine to creating entire workshops for computer science professionals across the country on behalf of Microsoft Philanthropies. So just doing all kinds of work, all of it that I would tie under that umbrella of science, education, and digital media. If someone came to me and said, hey, I'm really interested in doing the kind of things you're doing, but I'm not sure, I'm excited about it, I don't consider myself an expert, what should I do? I think looking back on my experience, I would say that I've kind of not even perfected my craft. I practiced while I had a full-time job. And I looked for opportunities to continue to practice inside that role. That made the practice low stakes. It was fun when I was creating graphics and stuff because it didn't matter. My bills were paid. Listen, creativity is a lot harder when there's something on the line. Am I eating another package of dried beans this week versus the price of eggs going up? Am I saving this egg or am I buying some more? I think those kind of things add a layer of pressure that I think isn't helpful when you're first starting out, because you already are fighting, maybe it's imposter syndrome, maybe it is self-doubt. You're fighting all of these other things. And so what I would say is to, if you have something comfortable right now, look for opportunities to expand your skill set and to continue to practice so that you feel really comfortable. So look for opportunities to grow within the career you're already in. I think too often people are divorcing creative entrepreneurship as a standalone field when I think it is an overlay. Creative entrepreneurship is something you need across all industries. It's not a vertical, I think it's a horizontal. I think it goes across these different verticals. I think one of the things that can be really confusing, but now I feel like I've learned how to kind of surf this, is like the wave and the undulations of what it looks like to be a creative entrepreneur. And so I've been leaning more into film and visual stuff, but that's only because my audio stuff was taking a break at the time. And so now I'm leaning more into the audio work because Dope Labs is coming back. We haven't had an episode since 2022, but we will be back on air starting March 9th. And being able to lean into these other sets of skills during that off time, but also ready to jump right into it when we come back in March, that feels good. I think just trying something is the first step. And I think the second part is finding a creative community. Like, my creative community includes some of my friends from college who would consider themselves not creative at all. My growing practice of creative entrepreneurship looks like having a Substack with 25 people following it. All right. And those, I know maybe at least 23 of them. And it's just the practice of writing. It's the practice of putting some doodles out there. It's the practice of just spitballing ideas. I made one episode of a podcast that was just for me and my friends, that was just to keep the growing and building those muscles. It was very different from anything I'd already done. And I think finding people to practice with and to share your practice with, so that it's lower stakes and so that you can get feedback and you can see, hey, this was exciting for me. Did it move anybody? If you are looking for things to move others, or is it just something that is a release that I find rewarding? I think all of those things are valid. I think if I were to step back and give one piece of advice that I think I didn't take and I wish I did, it is to not seek permission, but to just create. I think AI is no different than any other technology that we've seen come about with great promise, that we've seen mirror the systems that are already in place in society, and that we've seen exclude those communities that haven't had power if they don't adopt. And so when I think about AI, I try to divorce the narrative from how I might want a tool to support me. I think that often technology can be seen as this thing that separates us or divides us or keeps us disconnected from one another. And I really try to say, like, how can I make technology work for me so that I can be more present in my day-to-day? So I'm using AI to do a first pass of what I'm writing and saying, hey, summarize this and distill this down to the main points so that I can save time when I write my producer, right? Or when I write, or even for like tasks that used to take up a lot of time that I dreaded when I'm, if you're running your own business, there are things that you just dread, but there are things that need to be done. Keep a running list, prioritize this based on the deadlines I've given you. I'm leveraging AI in that way, but when it comes to talking to my audiences, I'm not really using AI there. I think as we see the rise of AI, what we're going to see is the rise for the need and the desire for human touch and communication. I think when you have all the information available, what you also see is that you need people to filter through that information and you want someone to tell you what to think. And so I think in a time where information has become so accessible, I think what you're going to need more of is people to actually sift through it and people to add a personal touch to it. I think in some ways AI helps me be more efficient at my job, but also it makes the human nature of what I do even more compelling to folks. And so I think there are things that are happening with AI that we don't all know about, that may not be as advantageous. I think, who is that? this author, Joy Buolamwini, I think if I'm saying it right, Unmasking AI. She has a book called Unmasking AI. So I think there are people that are doing great work and talking about some of the issues with AI, but I do think, just like when we look at podcasting, when we look at the early wave, podcasting was very white and male, but now, and there was a lot of money in it, and now there's not as much money in podcasting, but it is very open. And so I think all of these technologies can be tools used to democratize media, and I think we have to ask, how can I leverage that tool for myself instead of just, I guess I better do this thing now because it exists. I think the earlier you adopt, the more impact you have on how these technologies are shaped. One of the things I used to really complain about when I tried to use, and sometimes we're already using AI and we don't know it, it's just not marked as AI. Like on Dope Labs, I had a phone number that people would call into. So I was the person that checked all the voicemails and the text messages. First of all, people are sharing a lot of things. That's the first thing I'm going to say. But I would get these transcripts, and the transcript from Google Voice would always be so awful if it was somebody Southern, Black, somebody that's not speaking in a certain dialect or with no accent. It will always kind of butcher people who had any kind of accent, any kind of flavor on their conversation, okay? And I think the more we lean into that and say, okay, if AI is going to be used to listen to voices and to filter information, how do we build AI that's representative of how people are talking or how people in a certain region are talking? I just participated in an interview for an AI startup that is looking to get more Southern voices in their database so that we can be heard, right? And I think participation can inform what's available. I don't want all this technology to be available and I can't even use it because I sound like Nelly's country grammar, all right? That's not what I want for myself. When I think about what's next for me and what I'd like to be next for other creative entrepreneurs, it is opportunity that is not tied to big singular projects. I'm looking to contribute to a conversation and hopefully like a shift of the Overton window about who digital media and creativity and exploration, who that's for. I think as I continue to think about like how the world feels so doom and gloom and like all the media I'm seeing feels very, end of times. People are saying like, there's just so much that we can't control. I think there are still so many pockets of joy. And I'm like, who has access to that? Who gets to have their joyful story captured? One of the things I'm really working on now is leveraging some of my storytelling. I didn't mention it, but filmmaking skills, leveraging those skills and capturing stories for, like, I'm going to family reunions this summer. So if you have a family and y'all have a family reunion and y'all have a cookout or whatever, invite me. I'm going, I'm recording, I'm documenting families. Like I am saying, how do we build our own archive of what's happening? We're seeing things rapidly come down from the internet. We're seeing platforms collapse. We're seeing things go offline. And so how do we begin to be our own curators of what it means to be alive right now? Like I want 20 years from now, somebody to say, hey, Zakiya and Casey were people that were telling these kind of stories. And so how do we start to tell the story we want to be passed down in the future? And like, how do we get to decide, hey, digital media and filmmaking and all those things are not just for folks who have the dollars to make big movies, but they're also for people who have stories that are right next door to me. And they're also for our community that maybe is pooling together to say, hey, we want to talk about how we faced a changing tide in 2025. And so I want more of that.
Today's conversations revealed something powerful about the relationship between data and creativity. Professor Sándoval showed us how demographic data can amplify community voices and help artists prove their impact, while Zakiya showed us how creative entrepreneurs can harness their existing analytical skills to build innovative platforms for storytelling and community documentation. Whether you're a policymaker looking to support your local creative economy or an artist trying to understand your community's needs, remember that your most valuable insights often come from bringing different perspectives together. The future of creative entrepreneurship lies in making space for all of our stories to be told, measured, and preserved. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Until next time, we encourage you to continue nurturing your process. Farewell, and may all of your creative endeavors flourish. Could Be Pretty Cool News is a Could Be Pretty Cool original production. Created, hosted, and executive produced by Casey Lueders. Senior producer is Liz Moore, and supervising sound editor is Trinity Jackson. Our original theme music was composed by Camille Stennis and cover art design by AJ Johnson. To learn more about Could Be Pretty Cool and discover whatever else we're up to, visit us at couldbeprettycool.substack.com. Thank you for listening.